Vamos a iniciar. El día de hoy tenemos la presencia de la doctora Andrik. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here. Well, hubo un pequeño cambio con la presentación porque teníamos preparado para hoy, pero nos va a hablar sobre direct perception and communication. Entonces, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I very much am honored to be invited here by Kira and Sergio. It is an honor to present my work in a prestigious place. And so I'll be giving two papers. I'll give one today on an empirical study, and tomorrow on a more, I don't know if I want to say theoretical, but more overarching kind of presentation. So one kind of leads to the next one. Tomorrow we'll build on this one. So what I want to do is give a little backstory, like how did I get here? And I'm sorry, I don't speak any Spanish. I don't know any Spanish. I know, oh wow, that's about all. So I'll just give a rough idea of how I came to these topics, these ideas. I went to graduate school at UCLA to study language development, language and cognition. And okay, all fine. That means Piaget, that means, whatever people were saying was cognition. But the first semester in my first classes is in the cognition area, and it's on perception. And one of the first professors I thought is a person who had been studying with Gibson at Cornell, who was originating a theory of what he called direct perception. So I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. And it's very different from other theories of perception. It doesn't have anything to do with mental representations or interpretation or, signals from the senses that you then have to interpret somehow cognitively. It's not any of that. So I go along in graduate school and I say, okay, language development, but given direct perception, then what is it? Then what do you have? And nobody had any answer. Nobody was trying to put those two things together. So I'd always had an interest in poetics, and I thought metaphor should be a place where I can study this connection between perception, direct perception, and language. So that was the start. And that was a long time ago. So, yeah, some things have just happened since then. But so what I want to do is just give you a rough outline and idea of what this presentation is. First, I talk about direct versus indirect approaches to perception language. Then I talk about two researchers in particular. James Gibbs in perception psychology and Roy Harris in linguistics, because I think that they both have parts of a direct approach, a non-representational, non-cognitive approach to perception for Gibson and language for Harris. And then I bring in my study from a few years ago on metaphor, the development of. So how children and adults use metaphor in structured situations that I've set up to try to draw forth the metaphor. And that's an empirical study, very traditional, use categories, count categories, quantitative kind of study. But I think it's an example of a direct perception approach to communication. So let's go to the next slide. Is this over? I'm pressing this down.
Yes.
It's not here. Maybe I'm not pressing it right. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay. So if you want to study perception as a process of resonating to structure, that is, as direct perception, rather than as mental construction, what are the consequences for language and communication? That is the basic question. So James Gibson, was explicit about assuming that language is a fixed code. Here's the quote: spoken and written words presuppose a code. That's from the 1966 book. But he doesn't change those ideas in the 1979 book. And I ask, is that consistent with direct perception? To say that language is experienced, understood, etc., as some kind of code. If you take the usual approach to perception, which is that the senses give signals that then have to be interpreted, those signals are usually described as some kind of code. And then you can say language is a code and perception is a code. So it's easy to get them together. That's the traditional way of doing it. But if perceiving acting is reciprocal and direct, and language is a preset code, there's a mismatch. So the question is there a way of looking at language as something other than a preset structure that's some kind of code that the person just encounters in their lives? And this is where integrational linguistics comes in. Now, I only found out about integrational linguistics in about 2014, 2015. There was a conference at the University of Connecticut called Finding Common Ground. It was organized by Carol Fowler and Bert Hodges, and they brought together people who had unusual approaches to language. So not the typical, not the mainstream approach to language in either psychology or linguistics or cognitive science or engineering or anything. And at that conference, I heard about Roy Harris and his integration approach to linguistics. And then I thought, that's a possibility. That could be a way to coordinate direct perception and be consistent and talk about language. Because integrational linguistics rejects the code definition of language and describes communication as the ongoing process of the joint creation of signs. That's communication. So it may give ecological psychology a chance to branch into an area that it has not had much to say about: language and communication. So let's look at the indirect and direct approaches. The top line is what I call the indirect representational cognitive approach to perception. Coded signals are sent via the senses and then decoded, interpreted based on mental models. However you want to specify that. The action of an organism is some kind of motor program sent by the brain and executed by the muscles. Signing by human beings is the use of acquired, learned, preset, fixed code. Language as tool use. I think everybody's familiar with those ideas because they pervade our culture. We all live in that. Like water, like fish and water. But here's a contrast. The direct or ecological approach to perception by an organism. Mrs. Gibson, process of resonance over time to ambient energy arrays structured by the layout, events, and affordances. Structured by the layout that is perceptible to that organism that's perceiving. action of an organism is perceptually guided. Action is always perceptually guided, and it supports perception. Okay, I mean, we're all constantly, in an ambient array. You can think of light for vision, but it's really for all perceptual systems. There's an ambient array. They're always in it. We're always perceiving. We're always, in a way, forming that array. And that's so the surrounding and the organism is both contributing to the array. You know, I move my head and my whole visual array changes, but it is formed by what's around me. And I can see, if I pay attention to it, I can see that array, the structure, being occluded by the eye socket here, disoccluded by the eye socket here, and then turn this up. So I'm the perceiving organism, I'm constantly creating, bringing about the ambient array with the surround that's around me. And that, of course, supports any other action. If I want to pick this up. That's because of perception that I can do that. So the question is, what is signing? That's the case. There's a question mark there because it hasn't been worked out. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to work that out. So let's talk a little bit about horas and this other approach to language. Integrational linguistics. Has anybody ever heard of that? No. Okay. Brand new. Roy Harris was at Cambridge, and he was working in the, I believe, starting in the 50s and 60s. Cambridge did not have a linguistics department at that point. Or no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing this up. He was at Oxford. Cambridge was the one that had linguistics. And so Oxford had not, it gave it in comparative languages, comparative Romance languages, and been his work. But Oxford decided they wanted a department of linguistics. So they let him make it. And this is what he did. He did something radically different from what other people were doing. It's a little bit like, plants that grow in tiny little micro environments high up in the mountains. They have a different surround and they can do something different. I think of it that way. He was initiating this department of linguistics. He wasn't surrounded by something already. And he ended up doing something very, very different with it. He started looking at what he called the language myth, which is the assumptions that people make about language without questioning them, without thinking about it, without really even realizing. And those assumptions he called the language myth. He wanted to say it is a myth. So here's just 4 basic points. People assume, we have to think of this as the assumptions. People assume that language and reality, or the world, are separate. And therefore they have to be joined or coordinated somehow. And that, following that, like the world, reality, has to be coordinated with language by use of arbitrary conventional systems of codes, either vocabulary or rules alternatively. Arbitrary. You always hear that. Language is arbitrary. This is only an assumption. It's only an assumption. Everybody has direct experience with language their whole life, starting from before being born, probably. There's nothing arbitrary about that. It is what it is. It's experience. Okay, so that's an assumption. The next assumption. The codes and rules are fixed and static. They have to be learned. They have to be learned through communication. and then or if you're John Stan, you say they're not learned, they're innate. That's a radical another version. And then 4, if all of these other 3 are correct, then the only way to communicate is to somehow transfer the patterns of coded information from one line to another. That's what counts as communication. That's what Harris calls telementation. From one line to the other. That's the basic subject. Okay. Now, let's look at parallels between Gibson on perceiving and Harris on communication. So Gibson is on the left, perceiving over time at the level of the organism. He says this all the time. Perceiving is not snapshots. It's not, some instantaneous signal from some sensory organ. It is something that takes place over time. And I move my head like this. You can all do it. You can all try it. You can see occlusion and disocclusion, and you can see that takes place over time. The ambient array is changing. You are changing. You are acting. Okay? Harris says that there's a succession of items in individual experience. He also wants to concentrate on things that are happening in time, but he has a different idea about time. We'll see how far we get with that. But he is seeing that communication is also not in static snapshots. Okay, so we go back to Gibson. Perceiving is open. There is an open and creative ongoing character of the world and of the perceiver's interaction with it. The world is open and changing. It's not, conservation of matter, conservation of energy idea. The world is open and changing, and the perceiver's interaction with it is open and changing. It is endless. It's ongoing and endless. So the organism dies. Harris says that signing is always a creation. Signing is always a creative process. And in that sense, it's open. And then Gibson, perceiving is active, it always involves action. There's always action involved. Harris, sign making is active and not involved. So you can see that there's a possibility, maybe of bringing these 2 together. They have some common effort that they're making to deal with their topic. So this is bringing together the 2 different points, indirect versus direct, and perceiving and language. So if we start with the indirect, that's the left-hand column, the white columns. The indirect, this is what we always hear, what we always know, we always hear about. The indirect approach to perception, what I would say perceiving is not. Signal detection and processing based on a retinal image, assuming Newtonian optics. Hypothesis testing and inference based on the content of the senses, for example, the retinal image. The result of the physiological processes of the senses, signs sent from the senses, sense data or input from the senses. How many of you had a perception class? We said a perception class. Maybe included it in some part of another class.
Yeah.
Something about perception. So all of that should ring true to you, right? It's what you hear. That's fact. Okay, let's look at the indirect approach to language. What I say, language is not. Again. Yes, I know, but it's true. I say that. A thing in itself, a fixed set of elements and rules that are reference and syntax. A set of tools that are pre-formed, that is, words that recur, for example, words that recur. Separate from reality, world, context of communication. This is Saussures' effort, text structuralist linguistics, that language exists independent of the speaker. And it's the traditional and accepted way of talking about language at this point. Intellectual lives. So let's contrast those, which are familiar, to the newer way of looking at things. So these are the blue columns, the other two columns. What is perceiving? How about if we say perceiving is the ongoing coordination of an organism with its mutually related surround? The activities of the organism with its perceptual systems that resonate to structure in the world. The process of organismic perceptual systems resonating to energy arrays that specify the world as they are structured, because they are structured. The ongoing functioning of animate organisms with perceptual systems. This is another point to kind of notice. It's an animate organism that perceives. In other words, it's animal organisms that perceive. Human beings and animals. Yeah. All right. How about language then? How about this new, strange way of looking at language? That's the last column. Signing. Communication is the creation of signs in the immediate context of communication. The integration of present experience of signs with past experiences and future anticipations. A quote, situated ongoing human communication. So, if the indirect assumptions are not correct, then what is communication? Gibson put a lot of effort into thinking of organisms, perceiving organisms, and their surround as a mutual, as not separate. And therefore, they don't have to be coupled or conjoined. The perceiver and the surrounding do not have to be coupled because they're not separate. Especially, they don't have to be coupled by some kind of code or mental representation. There's a quote from Gibson, it's published in 1982, he died in 1979, but he was at a conference, and in the discussion of what they published at that conference, there's an interesting quote. He said, the terms affordance, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that term, affordance. Some people aren't. Some people are. Okay. The terms affordance and ambient optic array, we've just been talking about, bridge the gap between animal and environment because they point both ways. So with such concepts, I don't have to ask me a question about the relation between the animal and the environment. I've defined it out of existence. That's a radical thing to say. But what we're going to try to do is follow that kind of thinking. Follow through with that kind of thinking. And there are certain aspects of Harris's work that fit, I think. So that's what I want to bring out now. Harris says, for the integrationist, there is no sign without a context, and no context is given in advance. Signs, in short, are not waiting to be, quote, used. They are created in and by one act of communication. And Harris makes a similar statement about signing human beings in the process of communicating. They are not separate from the world or each other, but are integrated, quote, organically. And they communicate by integrating themselves with the world and with each other. This is why it's called integrationism. This is why this approach to linguistics is called integration. They integrate themselves with the world and with each other, even when they're creating signs. Okay. So we have to just have as a question, are those two ways of thinking, Gibbs on direct perception and Harris on creating signs, compatible? Do they help each other? This is the question. So now I want to go to an empirical study that could be seen as an example of this question, trying to bring together ecological direct perception and integration of linguistics. And this is a study of novel metaphors with children and adults. And I will be talking about it. I'll be describing it as utterances, metaphors as utterances across speakers. Novel metaphors are a prototypical case of the spontaneous creation language, creating a sign that is novel for the speaker. And for example, a 3-year-old, 3.5-year-old with her father watching fireworks. She points and says, "They're flowers." And the father says, "Yeah." That's just an example from natural observation. So is she making a mistake? Or is she making a metaphor? And that's what this study will try to tease out. So there's a perceptual basis to metaphor. This is what I want to claim in this study. There's a perceptual basis to metaphor. And that is the perception, the direct perception of the resemblance between the two different kinds of things. And I'm not using kind in a technical sense there. I have a technical word for it, phrase for it, but I'll come to that. So what I did is a study where I made pictures of objects that had been found out and burned by children. And then in the study, they were shown those pictures and they talked about pictures in 3 steps, in 3 different steps. So let me show you some of the pictures and metaphors that the pictures come from. And then I will describe how I structured the communication, structured the situation. So here's the pictures that I produced based on the natural situation in which I was seeing their fathers. And then I went to either other observations of children or children's poetry and looked through the different metaphors that they used and came up with photographs that corresponded to those different things in the metaphor. So this is a table that's giving you the 2 components, the topic and vehicle of the metaphor. So when she says they're flowers, the topic is fireworks, but the vehicle is flowers. She's bringing flowers in to say something about the topic of fireworks. There's a ground. The ground is the resemblance across those 2 different naturally occurring kinds. And there's the metaphor. Look, they're flowers. So then we have the whale spouting and the fountain going, a splashing movement of water upwards and downwards and cycling. Whales are diving through the waves, fountains spouting from their blowholes. So I won't show you pictures of all of these. This is just to give you an idea of kinds of metaphors and the age range. But there were 10. And from the older children, you get things like clouds are sailing, the tree is the monarch of the field, with the bushes around it, something lower around it. I don't know why that line is important. Or the clouds gathering a conference. Those are all 10 minutes. Okay, so the first step in the structured conversation was I just showed each picture to either the person that I'm talking with, the child or the adult, and just say, what is this? What do you know about this? So, and those were shown in random order, but then they're laid on the table. So there's, and it's all recorded and transcribed. So they're naming, saying what they know about the whole set. And the whole set is out there. That's the first step. The second step is I want them to match. I want them to make matches. And at this point, they've been divided into two groups. One of them gets the instruction. I hold up the picture, and I hold up the flowers, and I say, is there anything here that's like flowers? Out of the whole set that's anything here that's like the flowers? And they can pick whatever they want to match with. And then the other group, I say, is there anything here that's the same kind of thing? The same kind of thing. And then they can match. And that is the kind condition or the like condition. And they can make matches that are metaphoric, that is across naturally occurring kinds, or they can make matches that are literal, not across kinds. So there were more literal matches in the like kind condition than the kind condition. There's more ways to be alike than the same kind. The metaphoric matches increase with age, but the literal did not after age 4. After age 4, the literal matches were just as steep. All the ages. The metaphoric matches almost always occurred in the group where they were asked for what was the likeness. Very, very rare. Then I wanted them to talk about these features. So this is not a comprehension, this is not a language comprehension task. It's a perceptual task and a sign creation task, you have to say. Creation is not language production or utterance production, but sign creation. But here I'm using this word production. I want them to speak about these pictures, and I'm trying to arrange the situation so that they might speak metaphorically. I grouped together metaphors and similes and separate those two things. So you can say the fireworks are flowers, or you can say the fireworks are like flowers. And those two are different. I'm not arguing that they're the same, but for this study, I grouped them together. They're figurative. And you can also say the fireworks and flowers have a radiating form. That is a statement of the ground. That's not a metaphor. That's saying something about the symbols. It's not a metaphor in and of itself. So Browns are more frequent than metaphors. It's, easier maybe in some ways to just say what's similar, how they resemble each other, than to make this next step of actually saying that one thing is another. And the 4-year-olds were very, very infrequent, but the 6, 8, 10 adults showed an increasing pattern. The 6 was less than the 8 and 10, and they were less than the adults. So here's some things that the children said. They had put I had put the metaphoric pairs together. So I am already showing them the metaphoric pair. And I'm saying, how are they alike? And then I say, think about one, now tell me about the other. So a 4-year-old looking at raining and people crying said there's rain coming down their eyes. A 6-year-old, people with arms out, a tree with branches up. The tree is raising his hand too. Clouds grouping and people meeting. This is an 8-year-old. Some of these people don't think, and they say your mind's all clouded up. That's pretty bad. The 10-year-old, clouds grouping and people meeting. They, meaning the clouds, are meeting too. The adult, the fireworks and the flowers. The fireworks look like flowers. They both explode open and then eventually die. So here is a sample conversation. This is the level I want to get to. The report of the study was published in 2016, and it was pretty much what I just said, to do with some interpretation. It was the quantitative analysis of, my story, not these conversations. But I want to go beyond that because I want to look at the conversations themselves and look at them with the eye of thinking that it's a process of sign creation that's going on. Jointly between myself and the person I'm talking with. So this is an adult. I show them the two colors side by side. The fireworks and the flowers. And I say, here are the fireworks and flowers, how are they alike? And they say, they're both pretty much spectacular and beautiful. Then I take fireworks photo by itself. I take the flower photo and lay it partway over the fireworks photo. So it's partly covering the fireworks. And I say, now think about the flowers and tell me about the fireworks. And this adult said, the fireworks are, of course, our blooming fireworks. So this is the kind of conversation I want to now look at much more closely in terms of an integration of subversive language. And so I'm going to try to give an integrationist ethological description of conversation and sign. Resemblance across naturally occurring kinds affords metaphoric or figurative signs in communication. The speakers do not have to be coupled to anything, not to their environment or to each other or to ideas, because they are situated in their context. Both the physical and the social surround through direct perception and sign creation. Novel metaphors are not conditioned or required. Obviously, they didn't have the same metaphor, even in this situation where I really tried the structure. They didn't have to, and they didn't always. They're not conditioned or required, but they are formed and they communicate insights about the world. Metaphors in conversation are a type of cooperation between communicators in integrating cross-kind resemblance into their communication. So in this example that you have on the screen, I'm using a structured set of questions and photographs that make the metaphoric resemblance present in the surround in order to support the perception of the resemblance on the part of the participant and the subsequent creation of metaphoric signs by the participant. Questions and answers together form knowledge, and they constitute cooperative completions of knowledge. So in this question and answer kind of conversation, it's a particular kind of conversation, but it's a question and answer. The people are building up together novel metaphors. Metaphors exist across utterances and speakers. And note that the resemblance and the verbal metaphor are not coupled. They are not assumed to be separated from the beginning. Perceiving, acting, perceiving, talking, perceiving, conversing, perceiving, thinking are all integrated and do not need to be related, connected. But they should always be studied and analyzed in relation to context and levels of context. And so, okay. This, I pretty much already just said. So to come back to that beginning point where we've got Gibson and Harris. Gibson tends to separate language from perception by calling it a code, by calling it a preset code. And Harris implicitly separates perception from language because he talks about that we know things in the world because of the retinal image and interpreting the retinal image. So the question is it possible to take the best of both worlds and find where perception and language integrate? So one way of thinking about perceiving and acting is that they are never separate. This is just a diagram to kind of try to emphasize that. And here's a question. Are perceiving the same? Thank you. It's late in the day. I think get organized.
Hi. This has been really interesting. So I was earlier just taking a look at the paper that you published in Biological Theory, which I think justifies that I ask you in the context of what you presented now about time frames and the antiquity of the possibilities of having the processes that you are talking about. And in that paper, you speak about animals, right? And that evidently involves considering them in terms of ecology and even evolution.
Yes.
Process.
Yes.
So I would be really interested to know what is your perspective on this longer or more deeper time frame.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I may, well, why do you think about the answer? In a way, the question has to do with a seminar that I attended yesterday in the institute where I work, which is the Institute of Biology here in this campus. So it was a very interesting study of this orchipes. This is the common name of this euglossini insects that have these unbelievable matches with plants, and especially the reproductive structures. So there, what is really amazing that you see in those cases, and that might have or not, I don't know, you will tell me, some relation, some connection to your story today, is that there are scents, odors involved in the way in which the bees, identify, recognize, actually choose the flower. But then the other aspect that's also really mysterious and amazing is the coupling of the morphological structures in the bee body with the body of the flower, which necessarily, in one way or another, involves millions of years of interaction. And that's really amazing, I would say. Very mysterious. So I just, this example, from my perspective, could offer some additional elements to maybe even reinforce some of the conceptual points that you're trying to make. Because there are more than one sense modality involved.
Oh, yes.
So I would say that when we speak, we don't realize it, but there are chemical ways of communication in the room, right? That are somehow influencing the way in which we have this linguistic perceptual interaction.
Yeah, no question about that. I just want to say that Gibson was so focused on vision and objects that it's easy to take all the examples from that. And that's where most of the research has been done. But we constantly have to say it's not just vision, it's not just vision. So there is a chemical sense paper that I did with John Pittenger ages ago on bacterial chemotaxis and how there can be a direct perception account of how bacterial chemotaxis takes place. So yes, definitely. All the senses need to be characterized this way and thought about this way. And there's no question that the idea of mutuality.
Is the idea that you developed in the paper?
Yes, the idea of mutuality, that the organism exists in mutual, you can't even say relation, exists mutually with its surround. And the connection is direct perception on the part of the animal organism. So the bee can perceive. I would say the bee can perceive and choose. The plant cannot. Okay? The plant can react. The plant can react, but it cannot act. And there are many psychologists who say plants are intelligent, and there are even some biologists who say that.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm
encountering.
Yeah, and this is what I'm encountering here. Okay, by saying it's the animal that perceives. Now, the mutuality of the organism and its surround is really, really important in thinking about evolution. And I haven't thought it through. I haven't thought it out. I don't have an answer, but I know it's important. And it matches with, or let's say it coincides with people who are trying to bring the organism as the unit of analysis back into biology. So organicism is one word for that, where you're not talking about physiological, suborganic physiological systems. You have to be talking about the whole organism. That has consequences for evolution. You know the Nicholson paper?
Sure.
Yeah. There he goes.
Nicholson.
Yeah. He goes over in more detail consequences of organicism for evolution.
Right.
And this is good and true, but what the organicists don't have is direct perception. They don't have the theoretically consistent way of connecting the organism to the environment. So that's where it would be the work of taking some of those ideas from Nicholson and making them fit with mutuality and direct perception. It's not impossible. I'm working on a paper now that's the organicist developmental approach to ecological psychology. So I'm trying to bring organicism into ecological psychology. If you have some ideas about how it fits with evolution, let me know.
Yeah, well, we have been talking about something in Melina's
I need to know.
seminar. But by the way, Melina invited me to your seminar like an hour ago. So I didn't know that you would come.
Okay.
So,
Well, tomorrow I'm talking about the much more general, much more overarching, approach of being able to talk about direct perception and signs. How it relates to animals is also very, very important. But linguists don't think about that.
are you talking to Danny Nicholson about this?
I have not, no, I haven't communicated with him. I probably should send him that here.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt the session, but maybe later we can talk about that.
Yes, that would be helpful. Absolutely.
There's a lot of back here.
Yes. No question.
Yeah, it's a radical departure.
Yes.
But I'm used to. So I think it's very good that you use novel metaphors. It illustrates the idea very, very, very clearly. That's great. Yeah, you're right that it's very qualitative use of this active involving the language. But of course, the question is how long it reaches, right? What happens in the rest of language, right? Because you're presenting this as a model of language. You really want to change our whole conception of language, not just these cases of novel metaphors that have always been difficult to deal with for literature.
Yes, right. That's true.
So we know that it's a problem for us, right?
That's an understatement. It's usually, I didn't even say that, but it's usually just sort of said, oh, that's not really language. That's some strange federation. We're not going to talk about it.
So we know that that's our problem, but then the question is, how do you do the other way around?
Yeah.
How do you extend this to the rest of language? In those cases where it seems like.
Yeah. Well, there was one little piece I didn't say, which is a little bit of an example.
Okay.
In that conversation, is it in the, do you mind if we go back to the slide conversation? Can I get a slide on that? Oh, I do have it. Okay.
Yes.
So, there. Both pretty much spectacular and beautiful. But there, the didactic term. In language, the traditional approach to language, they say, oh, well, there's a rule for relating the didactic term to its reference. And what I would say is didactic terms are possible because communication is happening.
Yes.
Otherwise, there would not be enough didactic. I think that it's going to be necessary to turn things around.
Yes. Okay. I want to get here because traditionally, at least debate, the reason why people tend to present language in representational terms is precisely the name suggests when things are not present. So that is why it is separated from perception. Because when you have perception and present, you have the photos there, you have the person you're talking with, the picture that what you're doing is coordinated with things that are present through perception seems very likely. When you are talking about coordinating past experiences, future expectations, I don't know how.
This is where the account of time.
Yes.
And Harris and Gibson are different on that. That is going to be a problem, right? Because Gibson is talking about it's really true, really important that there are no snapshots.
Yes.
Everything takes place over time. And it's an ongoing process. And it's ongoing for the person's life, for the organism's life. So some changes are slow, some changes are fast. Some variants are over is no memory. So,
Just
and the feeling of familiarity is the proceeding of invariance, it's proceeding of the persistence. When you all walked into this room, we've been here before. You are perceiving the persistence of this room. You're not perceiving this room again. You're perceiving the persistence of this room over time. There's some work on that. There's some work away. Gibson doesn't say that. Harris doesn't say that. He says that things have to be integrated over time, and that's a problem. But it's only because it doesn't have records.
Thank you.
Oscar?
Thank you very much. I have two questions that are going. So I want to ask you in what way novel metaphors are really novel, and I want to ask you this because you make this distinction between novel metaphors and conceptual metaphors, right?
Well, I would say novel metaphors and frozen metaphors.
Okay, I see. But my question has to do with the importance or not of differentiating metaphor under template, right?
There is a distinction. There's a very big distinction, and there's two publications on that I can refer you to.
Yes, but my question is because if I understand correctly, the difference lays on this notion of separating performatory and explanatory perceptual activities, right? Because to perform is different than to explain, right? And in that sense, then
I'm not sure that I go on with that.
okay,
I'm not sure I go on with that.
okay.
Because I think explaining is a certain kind of performance.
Yes. Okay. Then in what is the basis? If that's true, what is the basis of this differentiating between
frozen and novel.
no, in the first and no?
Between pretend and metaphor. Well, in pretend, there's a substitution going on, and the substitution is perceptually grounded, often, especially with children. But in metaphor, it's not a substitution. It's not a substitution. It's more like a seeing through. Seeing one thing through another.
Okay, so
I have a chapter called Seeing and Seeing As. And in that chapter, pretend and metaphor are separated. Pretend and not metaphor. And then there's some empirical work after that from one of my colleagues.
let's see. And last thing, you have said in this table and compared Gibson and Harris in the white one. Can you perhaps
Go back to it.
yes. It's there. It's just because out of curiosity, what language is not, and then what communication is. What would you say is the difference in this context between language and communication?
Yeah. Well, because I wanted to stay with Harris's terms on this part, because he constantly wants to say signing and communication, because he wants to separate from the so sure and structuralist account of language, where it is called language. I mean, even calling it language comes up in what he talks about the language myth. The language myth, he's got quite an extended, writing on that. I've just given the tiniest bit of an iceberg.
I also have a question regarding novel metaphors. In your paper, it seems that it is linked to another concept, spontaneous metaphors. And here you also link it to spontaneous language or the use of the spontaneous language. And my question is, to what extent, if the use of language is not spontaneous, does that mean that the metaphor is not novel? If what I mean is, if there is some degree of deductive reasoning in the language or in the cognitive use of the language, then the metaphor is not novel?
Well, if you use that kind of approach where you're talking about reasoning and cognitive structures, you just won't have the same definition of metaphors and the same definition of novel. Metaphor. It's completely different to take that approach.
What is the definition in this case of spontaneous metaphor? Maybe that's what I'm not getting.
Well, what do you mean by spontaneous novel? Those are the same things. Spontaneous and novel are the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a judgment. I mean, you kind of have to make it, but you can observe it. You can hear children making metaphors, or anybody, if you just tune your attention to it, and then it's a question of judgment, because you don't know that whole person, you don't know that person's whole history, so you don't know whether they never said that before, but or never brought those two things together before. In that way, you don't know that for sure. But there is a kind of insight, kind of mood to it. Somebody is realizing something for the person. And that's just something that you notice. I saw that 8.5-year-old, say that about the fireworks, and how excited she was, and how her father smiled, and said, yeah. But it wasn't something that she'd already said. It's a question of observation.
I have one question. Do you try to see the way that children produce metaphors without any visual stimulant?
Well, I have a diary. Again, this chapter that I just mentioned, the Sitting and Singing House, refers to some of my diary entries on my own daughter. And this is just more examples of what you would call, I guess, natural interaction. Life is going on. And she says something that's meant. But because I was doing a diary study, I took the notes. And even with some of it, I checked certain things. Like not right then, but the next day. I would check certain things so that I make sure it wasn't a mistake. And so, yes, there are some studies like that.
And I have another question. Is you speak in many papers that you wrote about metaphorical resemblance and perceptual resemblance. I guess, I don't know how to say, but there is a conceptualization when you speak about a metaphorical resemblance that it's different from perceptual.
Well, it's a type. I mean, I would be trying to say that we perceive resemblance directly. But there's one type of resemblance that we perceive directly, and that is across naturally occurring kinds. That's my technical term. Naturally occurring kinds. That is a subset, it's a subtype of resemblance.
But how is the switch between one to another? Because in one terms of developmental, of cognitive developmental, they have to change.
No. It's just a question of, this is what I'm trying to show in this empirical study. And again, it's so limited, this kind of study, where you have children from different ages who, yeah, and not a longitudinal study. It's like doing comparative psychology where you compare different species, you know, almost, to have these different ages. I mean, I can certainly critique this method. No question about that. But at any of those ages, what I've shown is that children can perceive resemblances within kinds and across kinds. And the perceiving of those, I would say, is the same process. It's just that the resemblances are different because they're across kinds and not naturally occurring kinds. Anyone else? Thank you very much for so many people coming and attending so well in the late afternoon. Gosh.
Thank you so much.
And I'll be here tomorrow with more dense, complicated things.
Bueno, nos esperamos mañana. Thank you.